Welcome everyone to our seminar and also welcome to the online participants. Today is actually a very special day. It is the International Day of Mathematics, also known as Pi Day, since it's the 14th of March. So it's a very happy coincidence that today we also get to learn a bit more about Kavir's mathematics. Kavir is a master's student of mathematics in our discipline. He recently submitted his thesis on aspects of topological data analysis. And one of the key focuses in his research was also Morse theory. During his time and his studies during his master's, he had the opportunity to travel to the University of Bremen, and he had been engaged in a research project. So in today's talk, he's going to be sharing more about the work that he had done while in Germany. We look forward to your talk.
Hello. I was going to start my talk off with, hello, my name is Kavir Sumaraj, but that's been taken. So I'd like to thank you all for giving me this platform to speak about my work, and I also like to thank everyone for your time and attention. So I'll briefly go over the contents of this talk, and then we can jump right into it. And I'm going to try and keep it surface level as possible, explaining the ideas so that the intuition is what you really understand. Okay, so the graph homotopy mergegram. I wish there was a better name for this. It's a bit of a mouthful, so I am open to suggestions after you hear the presentation. This was work done with Pawel, Anastasios, and Jan. So the first thing we look at is central ideas in TDA. This is because the graph homotopy mergegram inspired and uses a lot of ideas from topological data analysis. Topological data analysis is abbreviated TDA. We'll then look at a particular type of filtration of graphs called the edge filtration of a complete graph. We'll then discuss the graph homotopy polynomial. This is a polynomial which can summarize the details of the graph up to homotopy equivalence. We then look at how do we extract a sequence of extract persistence homology. That's a prominent tool from TDA, from a sequence of these polynomials. We'll then look at our contributions, which is something called the graph homotopy mergegram. What does it look like? What does it do? What are the implications of considering it? And then lastly, we look at results. And if time permits, we can discuss future directions. So TDA, or topological data analysis, like the name suggests, is to use topological methods to analyze data. Data can come in many forms, but it's often that data is recorded as a collection of points. It can be recorded as those. There are other mechanisms, but we'll discuss the general pipeline when data is recorded as a collection of points. So the late 90s and the early 2000s weren't just a good year for music. It was a good year for the topology because that's when the foundations of TDA started to come about, which is relatively young for an area of mathematics. So there's a lot of perspectives that need to be applied to TDA, and we can use just generally anyone who studies the field of shape to topological data analysis. So general pipeline is, we have a data set, which is a collection of points. To this data set, we associate a shape, and then we use methods from study of shape to extract or highlight the topological features of this shape and entirely identify the data set by these topological features. That's more or less the general pipeline. Here's a fun example of a flamingo. So like I said, we have a collection of points, which for us as mathematicians exists as a finite subspace in Euclidean space Rn. It's actually a finite metric space. It's finite because data is recorded finitely. And we call this a point cloud. It's literally just a cloud of points. So to this point cloud or data, we need to associate a shape, but we don't particularly associate one fixed shape or one space. We associate a sequence of topological spaces called a filtration. Filtration is a sequence of topological spaces where at any given position T, the topological space at position T, must contain all the topological spaces at positions prior to T. So how I like to think of it is filtration it embodies the evolution of our data sets, where the initial state is a collection of distinct points, and the terminal state is some sort of terminal shape, and in between each time or position, the topological space grows towards the terminal shape. And it's usually the case in TDA that filtration, the topological spaces in filtrations are simplicial complexes. Simplicial complexes are these triangulated type of environments where you glue varying dimensional triangles together. There is a variation where people do research with something called cubical complexes, but it's generally all fall under the umbrella type of topological space called CW complexes. Now, this frequent use of simplicial complexes is because we need to keep an eye on how to apply this to a computer. TDA is technically an applied area of mathematics. So we need to focus, how can we put this into a computer? How can we encode it? And that's why simplicial complexes are used. It makes things efficient. So what we do is we have point cloud, we associate a shape to it, which is actually a sequence of shapes that represent an evolution of our shape, of our data sets. The next step, I said, is to extract key topological features. So in algebraic topology, a prominent tool is homology. Homology, essentially, without getting to the fine nitty-gritty details, is how do we count the number of holes in a shape. So certain algebraic constraints enforced by the definition of homology describe a well-defined notion of what an n-dimensional hole is. So I just want to point you to this visual. In the first frame, we have a simplicial complex made up of triangles glued together. These edges are one-dimensional triangles, and these dots are zero-dimensional triangles. And we know that this is just a two-dimensional triangle. The second frame is a combination of edges or one-dimensional triangles chosen in a particular fashion such that it satisfies the algebraic constraints enforced by homology to describe what we can define as a one-dimensional whole. In the third frame, we can see that this combination of edges, in the particular manner that is chosen, describes a loop with a hollow center. And in layman's terms, that's what we understand as a whole. But the algebraic definition of homology describes a consistent definition of higher dimensional holes. And homology groups count the different dimensional holes. You get different homology groups for varying dimensions. So homology in the context of filtration is called persistence homology. So the n-dimensional persistence homology group essentially it monitors the behavior of the n-dimensional holes as they are created, as they are destroyed, and how they behave as the topological spaces develop into some sort of terminal space. So what we do is we look at the homology groups at every single topological space in our filtration. And we record this behavior as an interval, the time in which the hole is born and the time in which it dies. And that's on our left-hand side, that's how it's visually represented when we record the details of homology as an interval. We can alternatively plot these intervals on a diagram called a persistence diagram. And they are plotted as points. So the general idea is we have two data sets, we want to compare them. We associate a filtration to each of these data sets respectively. The manner in which we associate a filtration is, there's different manners, each with their pros and own cons. So we won't get into that. So we have data filtration. To these data filtrations, we then study the homology groups and we get something called these persistence diagrams. To see how different these data sets are on an n-dimensional level, we look at each, the corresponding data set n-dimensional persistence diagrams, and we measure their distance. And the distance is measured by something called the bottleneck distance. But there is another one called the Wasserstein distance. And depending on how far apart these persistence diagrams are based on the bottleneck distance determines how unalike these data sets are on an n-dimensional level. Let's just very briefly where the mathematics stops in TPA. The next steps start to go toward machine learning and vectorization. That's how people compare data sets using topology. Now, I just want to take a step back and focus on not necessarily something so high dimensional. Let's look at graphs. A graph is a visual representation of pairwise relationships. Basically, it's made up of vertices and edges connecting with the vertices. Now, we will look at a particular type of graph called the complete graph, which we denote by Kn. The complete graph of n vertices, denoted Kn, is a graph of n vertices, where every two vertices has a unique edge. Any two distinct vertices have a unique edge connecting them or joining them. On the top right-hand side, you can see this is the complete graph of 5 vertices when it's not known as an occult symbol. So if we also a spanning subgraph of our complete graph Kn is a subgraph of Kn, and 2, it must contain n vertices. So here we can see we have below this line here, we can see that these are just some spanning subgraphs associated to Kn. So if we collect all of these spanning subgraphs and we call it SSGN, we actually have that SSGN with respect to the subgraph inclusion relationship creates a partially ordered set. That's very interesting. So we'll get back to this, but I just want to look at a particular type of filtration. An edge filtration of the complete graph Kn is a filtration of the complete graph Kn, where the initial state is n distinct vertices, and the terminal state is the complete graph Kn. And at every time instance, a single edge is added. So for K4, complete graph of 4 vertices, this is just an example of an edge filtration of K4. Here we have 4 vertices in the first ray, an edge added, and we proceed in this manner until we get the complete graph of 4 vertices. Now, if we just pause and we look, each one of these frames and time instances is actually, in its own sense, a spanning subgraph of K4, or Kn more generally speaking. So a edge filtration is actually a subset of SSGN. In this case, this edge filtration of K4 is a subset of SSG4. Now, more than this, because of the partial order, edge filtrations exist in SSGN as a maximal chain. Now, this is good.
As you've added edges, I noticed the vertices are moving around. Is that just a coincidence?
Yeah, no, I did this physically.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is an interesting perspective to have about filtrations, to see it as a maximal chain in a partially ordered set. But the problem with this is, as the number of vertices grow, the number of spanning subgraphs associated to Kn grows, and it becomes enormous. SSGN becomes tremendously big. And like I mentioned, we always need to keep an eye on the computational aspect. It is technically an area of applied maths. So to encode millions, if not billions of graphs into a computer is a time-consuming process, and it requires a lot of the computer's resources. So we need some miracle to reduce the size of graphs in SSGN, but still keep the topological information of the graphs from SSGN. So there are 2 ways in which we can do this.
But assume that number it is a way of working out that number, correct?
Yeah,
in terms
exactly.
of
It's something
computation.
Yeah, so if we look at 2 topological spaces, one is homeomorphic to the other. It can be bent, stretched, or twisted into the other. And 2 topological spaces that are homeomorphic are, all the topological properties are preserved. Now, in terms of the graph, homeomorphisms, or homeomorphic spaces are a bit of a strict relationship. So we loosen the relationship by adding the action shrinking and collapsing over and above twisting, stretching, and bending. And this is represented by two topological spaces being homotopy equivalent. Now, not all the topological properties are preserved, but the large-scale properties are preserved, like connectedness and loops. Loops don't get reduced into graph. And that's essentially what we are interested in terms of graphs. So we look toward quotienting SSGN by this equivalence relationship. There's just two graphs that are homotopy equivalent. You see this edge is just collapsed and becomes that, and that's associated to that. Now, like I said, we quotient SSGN by this equivalence relationship, and we call that HN. So now HN is a collection of equivalence classes, where each equivalence class is a collection of graphs that are homotopically equivalent to the other. So they have all the topological information of each other, so you consider them essentially the same element. The partial order from SSGN actually gets translated into this quotient set by this relationship. If we have two equivalence classes labeled by G and G prime, G is dominated by G prime if and only if there exist graphs H homotopic to G prime G and H prime homotopic to G prime, such that H is dominated by H prime with respect to the subgraph inclusion relationship. So, like I said before, edge filtrations exist in SSGN as a maximal chain. But if we translate the edge filtration to HN as in terms of the sequence of equivalence classes, the edge filtrations equivalent in the HN are actually a maximal chain with respect to this relationship. So we can kind of view edge filtrations as a generalized, these edge filtrations in HN as a generalized variation of the filtration. And more abstractly speaking, we can consider maximal chains of HN as a type of filtration, a more general filtration. Okay, so I found this interesting. There's actually a way to represent the details of a graph up to homotopy equivalence with a polynomial. And we do this by, say we have some graph G. For any fixed connected component of G, we associate the term x to the b, granted that this connected component has b unique cycles in it. So x to the b. And to achieve the graph homotopy polynomial of G, we sum all of these terms associated to the various connected components in the graph. So I'll give you an example because that might have been a mess. So here we have a graph G on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, we have our polynomial. So to this connected component in blue, there is a single loop. So we associate the term x to the 1. To the next connected component, there is no loops, so we associate the term x to the 0, and that gives us 1. And to the last connected component, it has 2 loops, so we associate the term x to the 2. So we can actually describe an equivalence class via a polynomial. The equivalence classes of Hn, that is, because the equivalence class of Hn is describes graphs that are homotopy equivalent. And if we can describe a graph up to homotopy equivalence with a polynomial, we can replace these equivalence classes with a polynomial. And as Hn now, we can view it as a collection of polynomials. Now, a maximal chain, which we did see before as a sequence of equivalence classes, now exists as a sequence of polynomials. And if sigma is a maximal chain of Hn, we use the notation sigma subscript t to refer to the polynomial at position t, the graph homotopy polynomial at position t. So now we have a different representation for Hn. So here's a great example. Here we have an edge filtration of K4, complete graph of 4 vertices. And then we have its corresponding graph homotopy polynomials as a sequence. this goes to that, that goes to that, and so forth. So we actually view an edge filtration now as a sequence of polynomials. Okay, so the next step people usually take is to find the distance between things and we create these structures. And the distance defined by, in the paper, brain chains as topological signatures for the spread of Alzheimer's disease is two maximal chains, sigma and tau, are adjacent if they differ in exactly one position. A discrete homotopy of length m-1 between sigma and tau is a sequence of these maximal chains where at any two adjacent maximal chains in position must be adjacent as the description I just defined. And it must be of length m-1. The m-1 different maximal chains in the sequence. M different maximal chains in the sequence gives us a discrete homotopy distance of m-1. So how they define distance between two maximal chains, sigma and tau, is the minimum discrete homotopy between any two maximal chains. So if we look at this example, we have two different edge filtrations of the complete graph K4. We then associate their sequences the same. And luckily for us that in this particular instance, these are adjacent maximal chains. At the 0, 1, 2, 3 third position, we have that E1 is represented by the polynomial 1 and E2 is represented by the polynomial x plus 1. That means that E1 and E2 are adjacent maximal chains. And the minimum discrete homotopy between the two would be of length 1. So the distance is 1. That's how we describe distance between graph homotopy sequences of graph homotopy polynomials. I'm just going to say sequences of polynomials, but it's a lot to talk about. So a sequence of polynomials is not the best way to represent something. It provides an interesting perspective, but polynomials can be messy, and it's not the most concise way to encode those details into a computer. We need for a more efficient implementation. So we turn to what we know from topological data analysis, persistence homology. Like I said, it's just homology in the context of a filtration. And we have a filtration, so we need to now investigate the homology. So how do we extract persistence homology from a sequence of polynomials? So we know that at every two time instances, a single change is occurring, and that single change that occurs is an edge attack. So that means if we subtract the polynomials in adjacent positions, we have either one of two cases, instance 1 or instance 2. Instance 1, x to the I plus x to j minus x to I plus j, essentially means that two distinct connected components, one which had I loops and the other which had j loops, are now joined, and there's a new connected component with I plus j loops. In the second instance, when we get x to the I minus x to the I plus 1, the manner in which the edge was added was between a connected component and two vertices which didn't have an edge previously. So that means there's a new cycle within this connected component, and that's represented by the new term x to the I plus 1. So if we do subtract two adjacent polynomials and we get the first instance, what it means is two connected components are joined, which means a zero-dimensional hole dies. And if a zero-dimensional hole dies, we plot the point 0t in the zero-dimensional persistence diagram associated to our maximal chain sigma. If we have the second instance, it means a one-dimensional hole is born. And that means we plot the point t infinity in our one-dimensional persistence diagram associated to sigma. The reason this is infinity is because no matter how the graph can grow, the one-dimensional hole will not die. There's nothing that can fill the void because we're not looking past one dimension. And if you have a hole, you need something solid to fill it. And that's a two-dimensional simplex, which is not you're not going to find that in a graph. So a one-dimensional hole doesn't die, and it's only about, it has to be at a certain time where a one-dimensional hole doesn't die, and a zero-dimensional hole dies but it's been born since the existence of time. So here's an example. Here we have an edge filtration. We subtract the polynomials in respective times 0 and 1, and we get 4 minus 3, which is 1, which is there and interesting. That 1 can be represented as 1 plus 1 minus 1. And that is the first instance where we have x to the 0 plus x to the 0 minus x to the 0 plus 0. And thus we have a point 0t in the 0-dimensional persistence diagram associated to sigma. We continue in this fashion, and we add the next edge, and we get a similar occurrence. So we have the point 0,2 in the 0-dimensional persistence diagram. And we continue, and again. But here we have a different case. We have 1 minus x, given the difference between the polynomial in the third and fourth position. So this would mean that this satisfies the second occurrence, which means a 1-dimensional hole is born at time t. And as we can see, a 1-dimensional hole is born at time t. We continue in this fashion until we get all the points in the 0-dimensional and 1-dimensional persistence diagrams respectively. So I just want to briefly say that persistence diagrams are the bottleneck distance between two persistence diagrams of dimension n is essentially the minimum distance, the minimum way in which we can compare intervals between the distinct diagrams. I don't actually give the formal definition. And we actually managed to figure out that the bottleneck distance between the persistence diagram of dimension 0 and dimension 1 associated to any two maximal chains sigma and tau are bounded from above by the discrete homotopy distance between the maximal chains sigma and tau. That's kind of where persistence homology ends. Persistence homology, it keeps track of two details independently: the 0-dimensional homology and the 1-dimensional homology. So we know the number of cycles and when they exist, and we know the number of connected components and when they exist. But the graph sequence of polynomials tell us exactly which connected components have what cycles. So persistence homology does lose information. So we need something more informative. And this is where the graph homotopy mergegram comes in. Graph homotopy mergegram of some maximal chain sigma is the collection of labeled intervals I, gamma, gamma. I gamma is the interval and gamma is the interval. So I gamma is given as the interval of all times t such that the term gamma is present in the sequence of polynomials at position sigma t. So gamma might be present in various time slots, and we kind of combine all those time slots in which gamma is present, and we associate an interval to gamma. That doesn't make sense, hopefully this does. So we have two edge filtrations, E1, E2. We have the corresponding sequence of polynomials, and this is a visual representation of the graph homotopy mergegram. It's a list of intervals. So if we look, for example, at 3 in E2, it exists at time 1 because we count from 0. So it starts at time 1, and the term t3 doesn't exist at time 3. So at time 3, it's not present. Time 2, it's not present. And this is how we kind of build and get all of these various intervals. And we can actually recover the polynomial at any time. If you consider the polynomial at time 0, 1, 2, 3. At time 3, we draw a vertical line and we look at which bars intersect. And as we draw a vertical line, we see that the bar 1 intersects and the bar x intersects. And that means that x is present at time t, and so is 1 present at time 3. Not 2. And thus the polynomial at time 3 is x plus 1. And this is basically how we can recover the polynomial from this little picture. Now, I just want to make mention, a quick note, if we look at a snippet of an edge filtration of K10, a complete graph of 10 vertices, at time t minus 1, t, and t plus 1, we have polynomials given by 1, 2, and 3. If we focus on the term 2x, this means that at time t minus 1, we have two connected components, each with one loop. Here's one, and there's the other. At time 2, an edge is added such that one of these connected components which had one loop now has two loops, and that's represented by x to the 2, and this is just x. But then the way the edge is added at time t plus 1, we again have two connected components, each with one loop. There's one, there's the other. So if you look at this in the time of events, 2x is present, 2x is not present, 2x is present. So if we go back to this and we had to draw an interval associated to 2x would be represented as a disjoint union of intervals. So when we describe a notion of distance between these intervals, we need to account for broken intervals. And we do this by the following. So, like I mentioned, the graph homotopy mergegram is basically entirely identified by these labeled intervals. So what we do to compare them is we find the symmetric difference of two different intervals, same term label. Symmetric difference is the union of the intervals minus the intersection of the intervals. Union of intervals set minus the intersection of the intervals. And that given by disjoint unions is in itself a disjoint union of intervals. And then the distance associated to those intervals are the size of these intervals. And then we find the maximum distance, the maximum difference between these intervals, and that's how we calculate distance. So we look at this example. These are our corresponding edge filtrations as sequences. And these are the graph homotopy mergegrams. So if you just compare only the terms x and 1, so x in terms of E1 is given by the interval 4 and 5. X in E2 is given by 3 and 5. The symmetric difference, meaning this interval union that interval, set minus their intersection, is given as 3, 4. And the length of that interval, 3, 4, is just 1. So to this term x, we associate the distance 1. And then we find compare the various bars, and we find the maximum distance of intervals. And that's how we describe distance between graph homotopy mergegrams. So now we look at some results we had. They all have to do with distance, and well, most of them have to do with distance. So if sigma and tau are two maximal chains of Hn, we actually have that if sigma and tau are equal, the corresponding graph homotopy mergegrams are the same. So we can actually replace a maximal chain with its graph homotopy mergegram. More than this, as a corollary, because the distance I described very roughly is a metric, which I like to add the bottleneck distance is not a metric, it's a pseudo-metric. This distance is a metric. So if the distance between corresponding mergegrams is 0, then it implies that the maximal chains which created these mergegrams are 0, and vice versa. So we can kind of view our mergegram as this. It's a discrete descriptor that keeps all the information of this. We have a nice stability result. The distance between graph homotopy mergegrams, sigma and tau, is bounded from above by the discrete homotopy distance. And more than this, our two metrics are literally equivalent. These are about it with the results, I think. Oh yes, one more thing. So I would like that to be the special case in which these two metrics are actually equal, but they're not generally equal. And here's a counter example. If we look at the an edge filtration of the complete graph K5. Here we're given by E1. And its corresponding sequence of polynomials given by sigma. And we look at E2, a different edge filtration, and its corresponding sequence of polynomials. The discrete homotopy distance between sigma and tau is actually 4, and the distance between their corresponding mergegrams is 3. So here we have a case of strictly less than, which means we can't generally say less. Equality can be a possibility, if not. That's about it with the results. Maybe looking at time. Okay, so what can we do with this and why is it interesting? So the sequence of homotopy polynomials was derived to model the spread of Alzheimer's disease. So if you don't die of some other cause too, and you live long enough, if you have Alzheimer's, it would at some point spread to every area of your brain. So that's why a complete graph would be a good representation, because at some point that area of the brain would get Alzheimer's. But and I've got an edge filtration of the complete graph is a good summary of this. But now we would need to investigate other types of graph filtration and how we can associate its mergegram and its stability results and how we can replace them accordingly. And that would be to essentially so that we can summarize graphs and their behaviors, because something called graph neural networks. A neural network is basically a pipeline in which it takes an input and gives an output, and the pipeline recognizes some sort of pattern. So graph neural networks input is a graph. And this is interesting because graphs are usually, they can model things like protein, diseases, and you can have a filtration that summarized as a discrete input that could have interesting perspectives as an input in graph neural networks. So we need to generalize this mathematical theory more to other types of filtrations before you can apply them to graph neural networks. That's about it.
Questions or comments for Kavir?
Well, Kavir, thank you for a great talk. It's really nice to see this area of research taking up here, because it's got so many applications, not just in mathematical biology, but in AI, where they're looking at point clouds, looking at identified shapes. There's all sorts of very interesting applications. It's really exciting to see this. A little surprised because pure mathematicians don't like to do anything that has any applications, so it's nice to see that bias is not touching you. My question is very, very simple, because there's something there I just did not get how you were getting these. So when you work with these homotopy polynomials, how did you get your numbers, your 4, your 3? Oh, I know the power of x were loops, and for me, for the complete graph, almost seemed that the loop was an x to the power of 4, not 3. So
I mean, your guess is as good as mine, to be honest. I could have easily made a mistake. So I think. So
you said there's a 4 for the first one, right? So 4
yes.
meant 4 unconnected.
Yeah, 4 distinct connected. So
okay.
There are 4 x is 0 plus x is 0 plus x is 0 plus x is 0 is 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, which is 4.
Okay, and then for the next one,
this is x to the 0 plus x is 0 plus x is 0.
Oh, so because it was connected, then you just have an x to the 0 for that one. Okay,
and
so
here we have x is 0 plus x is 0. So we have 2. And here a loop is created, so it's in one dimension. X is 1 plus 1. And then we continue. X is 1 plus, well, there's no other plus.
Right, okay.
And then here another loop is created, so that's x to the 2. Right. And then only one loop can be created per each movement. So if this was x to the 1, and this is also x to the 1, and this is x to the 2, adding an edge between a connected component between two vertices that weren't previously connected can only create at most one loop. So if this was x to the 2, at most one loop can be created. So this would have be represented by x to the 3.
So even though you can count 4 loops, you actually don't.
You can count 4. You see, I didn't like to mention this, but it's mathematically rigorous to mention this. Even though you can count 1, 2, and then 3, 4, of those 4, you can count one of those can be represented as a linear combination of the other 3.
Ah, okay.
So it's not like an original.
Sure. That was crucial.
So I get that out.
No, that was bugging me. As soon as you presented that into the XQ, it was like, what's the else? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well,
Appreciate it.
I can tell you. You want to do that?
Another question?
So I have a question. So we also have the other technique of method, where given a point cloud data set, one can associate a graph to that point cloud data set. So have you applied this technique of polynomials to study the macro graphs and their behavior?
To be honest, I heard of math, I know it's but I don't have to know the time if you were developing it. I know about it. It's a good idea.
Yeah, I think whatever you've done here, you can translate it and then try and compare the benefits of macro graphs versus the complete graphs and energy.
It's just it's like a step into the summarizing graph.
Okay. Yeah. In the absence of questions, we'll thank Kavir once again. So, thank you to the online audience and to everyone that's here. We can now